everybody. We're back. So let us then continue our discussion of affect as it relates to post-structuralism, post-structuralist accounts. And as we destroy, we're not completely destroying because we are putting something in its place. So it's modification maybe rather than straight out destruction. So we talked about Tompkins, especially almost all throughout part 2 here. Now we're in part 3, and we're going to talk about affect and Deleuze. And as we do this, trigger warning time, I'm going to be a little graphic in a couple places here, so be forewarned. In the first case, I may say some things that are rather unpleasant, and in the second place, then I'm going to talk about Lawrence of Arabia, the accounts of Lawrence of Arabia and the portrayal in the movie, which are sexually charged and really describe male rape phenomenon. So that will be unpleasant too for perhaps some. So realize that those things are coming, and if you want to skip part 3, at least the first 10 minutes of part 3, then feel free to do so. So affect and Deleuze, it offers a cultural human geographic account of affect. So he's taking that approach, right? We see Tompkins as being super biological. Here we're talking more cultural, and this human geographic account of affect is tied to the idea of culture. Again, for Deleuze, affect is ever active, flowing from one state to another, and it's tied to a decrease, believe it or not, or increase in perceived power. And who does that remind you of? That was talking about as an emotion as a result of decreases or increases in power. Of course, that's very Spinozan. So we see that again, but now we're talking about affect as this continuous flowing stream from one state to another. It's always in the state of becoming. That is, affect, and this is the weird phenomenon of time, and this is why I wanted to keep time as an important component, the temporal component, the fourth dimension, if you will, because the present strangely probably doesn't exist. We have memory of the present, and we have anticipation of the future, and the becoming, right, the potential, and that's very Aristotelian, but it's not necessarily fixed in its identity, because in the moment, as soon as we describe in the moment, then the moment is in history. So affect forms into pre-configured emotion categories, and this again ties us back to this idea of structure, that the explanation of the affective stream and its changes really are a function of our language and our culture, our human geography, if you will. And at that point in time, it becomes fixed, right? As soon as we label, so here's my continuous, ever-moving affective stream. Boom, at this point, I say, I am feeling, and that is a description of my affective state just previously with an emotional label that is bound by the structure in which I'm embedded. So affect might be conceptualized as action, potential, there's that word, best represented by a verb rather than a noun. And affect thus kind of escapes representation, although we attempt to represent it in terms of emotion labels among other kind of descriptors. So affect is a potential that can cause us to become sad but joyous, if we're going to use the Spinozan term of assessing our level of power, but it's always in a state of becoming. And if we look at this picture here and a few seconds of happiness, now we have a unique perspective on this picture because we can see the whole scene. Obviously some of what's in this picture is hidden from the man and some is hidden from the child, and we can see, if we look at that child, we see this anticipatory stance, kind of this please, 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 and notice the affective stream is probably running relatively high. What is to come, right? And well, what do we expect? And based on our culture, what do you expect to happen next in this picture? What is this man going to do? Well, he's going to present the puppy to the young man, and the young man is going to be absolutely joyous. So his affect is in potential now, maybe in anticipation, with the potential to become joy. But let's suppose this guy is actually some kind of strange sadist, this gentleman, and he takes the puppy out and he strangles it in front of the child. I warned you, right? But notice that the affect has potential, and it's going to be potential that's realized in terms of what occurs next. That is the environment and our cultural interpretation of that environment. So in this case, what actually happens? Yes, he's going to present the young boy with the puppy, and they're going to be lifelong friends forever. So let's take away the sting off of that little demonstration. Now, Deleuze, when we talk about the separation of body and social meaning and forces, that the body then, we're going to advance the idea that the body is separate. So we're going to have a kind of a dualistic structure imposed on this, this idea. And I don't know if you've seen the movie Lawrence of Arabia. Many of you probably haven't. It's a wonderful movie, and it's about a British soldier, kind of this guy who was sent into the Middle East, right, during World War I, and his idea, his mission, you know, should you decide to accept it, it was a strange mission, was to take all the various Arab tribes, right, and unite them in an effort against the Turks, and the Turks were allied with the Germans, who in fact were our enemies, so the Turks were our enemy during World War I. So Lawrence of Arabia goes and he starts meeting with the leaders of the Arab tribes, right, and tries to coalesce them into a fighting force. And the term going native, right, is when we send this British soldier, he goes native, he becomes part of their culture to a large extent. And you can see through his manner of dress that in fact this is how he now dresses. He's lost his British uniform and he's riding camels, right, and becoming part of the Arabian culture, which is a multicultural kind of milieu at this point in time, given all the different tribes. So what happens during this is Lawrence is captured at one point and he's gang raped in the desert by Turkish forces. During this brutal torture, yeah, Lawrence's body then produces an erection. And this is a physiological response to the rape in Lawrence's case, certainly not something that he wanted to occur. The body can be viewed then as an autonomous entity, and you can see how this is kind of a dualistic kind of point of view. Lawrence's experience of shame is not due to the rape, because there's nothing to be ashamed of, because it's not something he could control. It was something that was going to happen whether he liked it or not. But his shame then, he pins down to the fact that he got an erection, his arousal represented by the erection during the rape. The shame is an idea as well as an emotional experience. That is, I should be ashamed for responding in this way, and culture would dictate that response. And it's also an emotion, it becomes an explanation. Lawrence views himself as powerful, and his body at this point in time has let him down. So we have these two entities. We have the mental Lawrence who says, oh my God, this is horrible and shameful, right, and a betrayal of my own power over myself. And his body has let him down because it responded in a different manner. It's the assemblage of these constituent parts that lead to the entire experience. So while mind and body are separate, we have to interpret them together, and thus the response, and notice the affective stream would have fluctuated tremendously here. How does Lawrence explain this? And his explanation ultimately becomes shame. So Lawrence's experience then, from Lawrence's account, because remember we're talking true story here, you ought to be ashamed. Bodily weakness which made my animal self crawl away and hide till the shame was past. So the shame of his body and his body response is overwhelming, and it's something that he just has to deal with until it passes. The mind then reacts as the body's first witness, and that's a fascinating kind of, and it deserves to be in quotes, first witness, because the mind is typically first witness to the body. The mind is affected by what it witnesses, and the mind is impassioned. Thus, the affective stream is is changed, right? Potential has changed, and what it becomes then has to be explained, and emotion then is the label that's put on this. For Deleuze, affects need to be understood through the context rather than individuated and abstracted as labeled emotions. So let's return to the reductionist idea. This emotion occurs in response to this emotion, and we try to pinpoint and map out these various emotions, right? For Deleuze, right, we need to understand the context. We need to understand the big picture. So it's a much more Lewinian point of view, right? Maybe more so than, well, it probably reflects a somewhat Jamesian point of view as well. And maybe that's why William James didn't seek to necessarily label emotions, tie them strictly to stimuli. He kind of avoided that. So that's about as deeply as I'm going to delve into kind of these negative aspects. So consider the trigger warning then terminated at this point. So the role of selection and perception, right? Perception is a snapshot of the virtual, thus becoming actualized. So perception then is kind of the culmination, if you will, of potential. That is, the end of potential signals the perception, which is going to signal a new potential. But and I'll show you my diagram for that. It's a snapshot, a slice of time and space. So we're keeping time and we're keeping context together in this. The whole can never be selected. We don't have the potential. William James said that the world presents itself as a blooming, buzzing confusion, and our selective attention picks out portions of it, the amount that we can effectively process. And notice that motivation affects that. So let's look at goals, motivations, and emotions. So we have here the selection process, but up here we have goals, motivations, and emotions. And based on what we want, what we're looking to do, right, what we're motivated or driven to pursue, and our current feelings, then affect what we attend to. That is the portion of stimuli that we select out of this buzzing, blooming milieu, as James described it. Also then, the goals, motivation, and emotion affect the way we comprehend what we have paid attention to. So this is a very individualized and very temporal account of what is noticed and how it is understood, right? And from that, then we have to prepare for memory, for future use. So we encode it and simplify it, and we might elaborate on it as well. Those of you, how many of you took the memory course, right? And we see that we have to then encode it into the preferred memory format, and we'll likely simplify it. That is, strip away the details, maybe elaborate to add meaning, because we're not all that good with details. And then that forms a memory, and that memory will be used in the future as part of this process. Now, the memory then, when memory is recalled, it affects what we think, and that's the cognitive output, and it also affects our behaviors. Right? But what we think and how we behave then in turn affects our goals, motivation, and emotion. So if we wanted a summary of our life, right, from birth to death, here it is, as the goals, motivation, and emotions affect what we attend to, right? And how we attend to those and understand them affects how we prepare it for memory and eventually remember it, and then its impact when it's recalled. So that's the wheel of life, according to, you know, kind of a cognitive psychologist, how about a social cognition type scientist. And that is the importance of selection, selecting what to attend to. And notice the structure is imposed over this entire process. So summing up Deleuze then, actual versus virtual, dominant theories of emotion, right, are seen at best as inflexible and insufficient. They're reductionist. We want to say, hey, this is the stimulus, this is the emotion, ignoring context, ignoring idiosyncratic experience, ignoring the memories generated by this selective process, right? Dominant theories of emotion then are seen at best as inflexible and insufficient, and at worst ignorant of the social and political forces that constitute modern subjective life, and that is the structure in which we're embedded. So emotional experience then can be described, at least in part, as a process of selection, attending to certain features of the environment as required by our goals, motivation, our drives, etc., and our current emotional states, right? at least in part, is a process of selection, a selection of a narrative, a sense-making device that is generated within this perceived context. And this becomes actualization of the potential. So we've returned to Aristotle, right? An oak tree has the potential to become a table. The acorn had the potential to become, and thus it is, our emotional experience is the story of potential in terms of time and context, but constrained by structure. So the affective stream is moving along. We're biological organisms. We select, we attend to certain aspects of the environment, and that causes the ball to roll in the direction it's going to roll, eventually determining what will the emotion label will likely apply. So the virtual, on the other hand, is that which has yet to become, and so that kind of separates the actual from the virtual, the experience versus the potential, if you will. So, and notice trading cards, yeah, Theory.org, UK trading cards. People create all kinds of strange things, do they not? So, Matsumi, affect and emotion. Well, affective excess is described as the realm of intensity. So this is a tad different than we were talking with Tompkins, because he was talking for qualitative versus quantitative. And then I'm looking at Matsumi, you know, because affect for Tompkins was the qualitative, the nature of it. And Matsumi is saying affective excess is described in the realms of intensity. So maybe intensity of experience, if you will. But it might be the intensity of the need to label. You know, there's a lot of different ways this can look at. Intensity can be defined as non-conscious autonomic experience, and that because it becomes internalized. Emotion is the subjective content which is described. So we have this autonomic response, right? And by definition, automatic, operates in non-conscious. It makes itself known, and then the emotion can be the descriptor, the subjective experience of the autonomic response. So we haven't, you know, traveled too far from where we've already been, using a little different language though. It's the sociolinguistic fixing of the experience, at which point it becomes personally defined. And the sociolinguistic context versus the language that's available to me. Right? And this is, again, is structurally constrained. Thus, emotion is qualified intensity. That is, the affect varies in intensity, and again, I'm going to supply a sociolinguistic label, i.e. an emotion label, to it. At that point then, once we've completed that task, the potential, the affect as represented as potential, becomes the actual. Its intensity is owned and recognized through this labeling process. So, affective experience, the intensity, is divorced from the content. It's a separate issue because the affective intensity varies to many different contents within many different contexts. Intensity is not verbal, can't be and can be experienced non-consciously. So it's once we bring it into consciousness that we can begin to label. Masumi suggests this autonomic experience rests largely on the surface of the body and on the skin. And now I'm starting to, I don't know about you guys, but it's kind of losing me. But notice we do have a lot of descriptors about affective intensity that like perspiration, like goosebumps, that locate themselves on the skin, on the external of the being, and it's the external of the being that is most immediately in contact with the context of the environment, be it hot or cold, humid, what have you. So mixed with conscious experience, linguistic fixing takes place and emotion can be experienced and described. So through this autonomic bodily response and process, fluctuating this affective stream, then we get to the labeling aspect, which is the description of the emotional experience. So where's it going to go from here? Big question. All right. And you know, this is really, really confusing, or not, you know. And that's cool because these writings introduce and describe new concepts that lead to different ways of not only to understand affect and emotion, but to understand what it is to be human. And really, are we feeling beings that think, or are we thinking beings that feel, if we want to go back to that statement earlier in the course? This allows us a potential for new questions we ask about emotional experience, right? Which will in turn force us, hopefully, to embrace new research paradigms to explore these questions. That is, to modify the structure which constrains our research ideas and opens it up to new research paradigms, researching new ideas that represent new theories. So the future of research then is possible research paradigms, especially laboratory experimentation, right, as forces us to understand emotion within the context of a small number of causal mechanisms, a small selection of potential effects, and that represents the independent variables and the dependent variables, and you know, in this very narrow view that the science office forces us into. So as neuroscience evolves and we stand to understand more about the influence of the affect as an autonomic process outside of our conscious attention necessarily, and making itself known into consciousness, right? So maybe we can kind of shed explaining phenomenon in terms of discrete, narrowly defined emotions. As to social aspects, we live in an ever increasingly condensed physical and temporal space. We have the potential to live more virtually, and that's perhaps going to change the way the structure inhibits us. We have an increased ability to select greater levels and more diverse amounts of virtuality. There's more available to us in the virtual universe. So structure may in fact be less dominant over us. And as we do, and the body becomes increasingly unnecessary as that relates to affect, if it's located in the body, what's to become of our emotional experience? That is, will we be brains embedded in machines but no longer have a physiology to support that it can be done mechanically? And that gets into sci-fi, but it's something to consider as the body becomes de-emphasized. So, we've been a lot of different places in this one and a lot of complex ideas. I think we should say goodbye for now. Baby mama wishes you all the best, as do I. So, have a great day. Bye-bye.